And that way it'll give a sense to our candidate who's in the house. And so I'm Leticia Marquez Magana. I'm a professor in biology, and my interest in the HEI is recently discovered but very long held. So I think I've always had this commitment, and now it's just got a voice and a space. And anyway, so I'm the chair of the search committee for the Health Equities Initiative Professor of Biology, and I was on the search that, the successful search that hired Cynthia Gomez. Maybe go that way.
All right. I'm Chris Bettinger. I'm a professor over in sociology, and we're conducting our own HEI search in a little bit. But actually, I'm just here because I'm interested in the topic.
I'm Bruce Walker from the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, and I'm serving on this search committee.
I'm Gail Weinstein. I train teachers of English to speakers of other languages, and we have a great interest in immigrants and the linguistic components of their access to health and negotiating with health institutions and taking care of their families and themselves. The language piece of that. So, glad to be here.
Cynthia Gomez, the director of the Health Equity Initiative, and looking forward to bringing on new faculty. So I really appreciate the involvement.
Will Nicola. I'm an associate professor in biology, and I'm basically a good friend of Elba from way back. We've worked a long time, and it's great to see her here. And of course, we're happy she's interviewing for this position. But I'm also a researcher in embryology and looking at skeletal muscle development.
I'm Ken Papp, the AVP for Research and Sponsored Programs, and I only go back to, when did you join New Mexico State, 1990?
91, 92.
I've only known her for 16, 17 years.
Actually, no, we met when you were the dean. Did we know each other before then? Maybe because you were in...
Well, I knew you. You probably didn't know me. That's the way it goes.
Oh, okay.
Of
I won't ponder that. When you're new faculty, you just don't want to think about that.
Yeah, I'm Robert Ramirez, and as you can see, I'm the cameraman. I'm also a professor of biology.
You look like an experienced camera.
I'm learning it as I go.
Yeah, please, push this button, stand by button, and push the record button.
Mike Goldman, Chair of Biology, and looking forward to having you as a Health Equities Professor of Biology.
I'm Diana Chu. I'm Assistant Professor in Biology, and I'm using a very basic biological system to study male infertility. So I'm actually very interested to see how basic scientists can really fit into the role of health equities.
So we're just saying who we are and how we're connected to HEI or thinking about it.
Can we come back to me?
No,
sorry. Oh, so Sally Calcione, and biology department. I study replication in telomeres, and I think that having students involved in these projects and attracting as much money as possible is a great goal. So I think that's all I can say.
Very good. So I did have a little bit of an introduction for you, but would you prefer, since we're introducing ourselves, to introduce yourself?
I think everyone's seen my resume.
That's true.
And I'd rather, we have such limited time. I want to, I can introduce myself, but I'm Elba. I'm the candidate. So
Okay.
You've seen my resume, and I just,
Okay, and the thing that she has a flight at 6:17, and so we're trying to stay on time. Right?
Well, we can go a little over because you said, but I'm a little worried. It's Friday. If I don't get in, I don't get until tomorrow because I get into El Paso at 11:30, and then I drive an hour, and it's still 1:05. But that isn't just, so we can go over, I think.
Okay.
And
I'll go gauge it by you.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I have prepared just some slides for conversation, but I'm easy. I'm very much, what do you want to get accomplished in the hour? And you can either ask me questions and go back and forth. I have material here I can show you. It's your call. What is your pleasure?
Did you prepare it, please?
Okay, okay. So what I thought I would present here are, they're collected from presentations. I have given a few. They're a suite of slides that address what I think are the themes that have compelled me to think about social justice issues as a scientist and as a bench scientist over the years. And topics for conversation based on what I gather are the needs of the institution and why you want a health equity person involved. And I have to commend you for what I think is a really visionary approach to facing the challenges of 21st century science. And I think that we need to use a 21st century approach. And I think I said earlier at lunchtime that, that institutions that are entering and seeing the issues new, not having an infrastructure, may be able to come up with more creative solutions because you're not justifying changing a pre-existing structure, which we all have been part of and know that you know what needs to be done, and then half the conversation is about how we change what's there to make it new, whereas all you have to do is do it the first time. So I think there's some benefits there. So I teach a science, ethics, and society course that came out of what is my dual experience as a person who's a scientist, but also a person who grew up in an international context, a woman of color, a minority, first-generation university person, not a native English speaker, having the experience in the school ground of having physical abuse from other students, having had that journey, which I don't dwell on now, but they were experiences that taught me early on what it's like to be a minority in many contexts. And at the same time, really being compelled to the bench sciences. But having come from this community and this background that was not a background of family, a tradition, of education, of basic science, of thought and thinking for its own merit in academia, always having these two components of my personality. Letty has said it so well, and we've talked over the years. Part of me is fundamentally a physics science geek. Okay, that's really who I am in terms of my intellectual interests. I enjoy quantitation. Wilfred and I could see we totally got into the equipment and doing that kind of thing. But at the same time, being a human being in a world and seeing that there are issues that need to be addressed. And for those of us in the basic sciences that have that mandate, it's really hard to reach across the aisle because it's really obvious for the people who work in social sciences or they're dealing in nursing. You can work with people, but we're working with molecules. And how do we now work together in teams? And how does my work, working to uncover issues of hearing loss in the laboratory, relate to the needs of people who are actually, have impaired hearing? How do we make that connection? So those did not seem easily resolvable. So I did it the way faculty can. I taught a course. And so what I do in this course is I cover what must be covered in the sciences today. You have to have ethics training for students. There are issues of scientific misconduct, academic misconduct. And in fact, if you go on NIH's website, we're seeing a large increase in cases of scientific misconduct. Whether that's because of reporting or whether that's because there's more incidences, we don't know. But certainly part of having more people doing science is it seems that there's more people also abusing the system. So the beginning of the course covers those issues. And quickly, the later part of the course starts moving into what are the implications of science? Who gets to do science? What kind of questions get asked? Is science value-free? And so here are, I think for those people who are involved in ethics, when you do analysis of case studies or when you're doing ethical reasoning, these are some of the considerations when you're trying to make decisions. You ask about beneficence. Who benefits from this project, from doing this? Non-maleficence, do no harm, and then respect for persons. And finally, the issues of justice. Is this equitable? Is this fair? And discussions of what is the difference between equality and equity. We can, you can do something, you can treat all people equally, but that doesn't necessarily mean that process or that act is fair. And to use, we could, for example, amputate everybody's left hand. To use an extreme example. Everyone was treated the same, but was that fair and just? So that's where social justice comes in. It's come into my classes. I actually use this a lot to motivate students in general education classes to think about science and to become engaged in science. Because the perception in introductory classes is that science is all done, it's all completed, there's no creativity, and it has no relevance when you teach introductory science. So I want to show you a few slides. So over the years, I've become involved in a lot of different projects. And so near and dear to those of our hearts who participate in MBRS programs, MARC programs, all the STEM diversity programs, is that who's sitting at the table asking the questions? And so I gave this slide this title, Equity in Science Participation. So I've had a lot of experience working with underrepresented minority students in the sciences, and in my university, very, very engaged in STEM faculty diversification, because we've had 30 years of these minority student training programs, and women comprise 50% of the PhD recipients, and in 2007, we just don't see that there is a huge difference there. So in terms of equity in science participation, these are just some slides I wanted to show you. Together with Mary O'Connell and Lisa Freehill, a sociologist and a plant molecular biologist, out of our frustration with this at our own university, where women are very poorly represented, and we don't even have to discuss minorities, there's almost none in the science faculty, we got funding from NSF, from the GSE unit, and so we have a grant to diversify STEM faculty. And this just shows you exactly where we are now in terms of faculty diversity across disciplines and faculty diversity in terms of underrepresented minorities. Yes?
Sorry, I'm not a scientist.
Yes.
What does STEM mean?
Science, technology, education, mathematics. And see, this is great. This conversation, you know, some of us know that. So it's the buzzword in science education for compressing what we think are all the branches that comprise mathematics. So thank you for that question. And so here it just shows, this is, Lisa put this line, this is the parity line for women would be 49%. That would be the aim if in the faculty, in the pipeline of students, you know, coming through, what would be the number of women, for example, in the pipeline, if we had them there. And so you see at the bachelor's level, women are above, and you see that decline in the pipeline that continues. And so we're well below parity. And this is life sciences, where it's the best result for women. This is where we know there are the most women. And even there, by the time you get to senior faculty, we're seeing now senior faculty across the country are maybe 27% along the science faculty. Okay. Now, we can look at underrepresented minorities, and the data that Lisa presented is that underrepresented minorities are 31% of the US 20 to 24-year-olds in the national population. And this is what the numbers look like among science faculty. Just absolutely, you know, when is this going to reach this? When? I mean, 2050? 2100. So we're facing a situation where in the sciences, the people in front of the room are going to look less and less like the people sitting in the classroom. And so that's just some data for you about this. And so we know that, so how can we leverage these resources to address disparity? So my interest in part of the attraction of SFSU is that you have a lot of the programs that I'm familiar with regard to underrepresented minorities training. And if you're interested in this, so what we did is we decided that you can only do so much working with the faculty, so we used a top-down approach, and we developed a best practices module by assembling deans and department chairs from around the country in different science departments to put together how they diversify their faculty. And this is now getting a huge amount of attention because of what's happened, for example, at MIT, at Harvard, with an individual, the president coming out, and the whole controversy, can women be scientists? So this is now filling a need, and they're doing a bunch of publicity on this. But if you're interested in this, you can go to the website, diversefaculty@msu.edu, and download the whole presentation and take a look at it. And it's informative, and it was assembled. It has data, a lot of metrics on engineering, math, computer science, a lot of different disciplines, and the students, and what's happening across the country. So it's got a lot of tables. And the idea is that if you want to integrate a department, you would then, this would be instructional for the chairs and the deans to try to get the faculty to integrate their faculty and diversify. And of course, we know that underrepresented minorities and women is part of the larger issue of diversity. There's age, there's, you know, this is a very large topic. And at state, I don't think that needs to be talked so much. So what I want to talk about now is a bigger picture. Okay, so we know that not everyone's at the table asking the questions. Well, who's getting the bucks? So is there equity in a health research funding allocation? And so this is, just to remind you, and that's why I asked Letty a number, and the number you came up with was SFSU has, what, $20 million in NIH funding? Is that what you said, from all the different programs together? Oh, we have it's about $20 million. Is that a year or total? A year?
It's
About,
sounds like a
it's
little
okay.
bit more for a year, but
Okay, so these are 5 states, and this is the amount of money they get per year, the state from NIH per year. Okay, so we look at the nation. NIH has what's called the Institutional Development Award Program, the IDEA program, and if you're in an IDEA state, and they've been circled here, and you can see where they are, and you can think about our national politics. This is where the states are, the IDEA states. They're eligible for different pools of money. Because in a 5-year period, if you're an IDEA state, there's a number, and I think that number now is you get a total of 5 years, the entire state, $80 million, or some number in funding from NIH. And so that makes you eligible for set-aside funds. If grants move into a certain category, they'll reach down and there's pools of funds to try to address the fact that research allocation in the country, there's disparities there as well. And then this is the poverty table. So red means where people are poor. And you can see, here's New Mexico, very poor state. And the South, of course, the entire South, Louisiana, now we go to the province, Alaska, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, these are some of the states. It's a really interesting, and so there's opportunity there. And then when you take a look at that and say, who are the ethnic populations? This is color-coded heat map with dark green being the strongest. This is where we see the countries being Hispanic. And so you take a look at Texas. We know that I think it's 2020, Texas will be majority Hispanic very, very soon. And California is turning greener, but it's a little different issue. So you see this wave of Hispanic populations here. But what's more interesting to me, and this is from the census, is this is states where there's multi-ethnic. This aqua, this turquoise, is across the country, and you look at the nation, you go, oh my God, it isn't like the colors are spread out. This is purple, this is red, this is green, this is turquoise. So here's multi-ethnic, where most of the people who live there are multi-ethnic. Red is when you have more prevalence of non-Hispanic Asians here, and white, so that color is mixed together. And then the purple, of course, is African American. So this really shows you the segregation in our country even today. And those are still the IDEA states. But what you see in the IDEA states is actually everybody's represented. So the layer of poverty and also being of ethnicity is sort of mixed. So those are just some tables for you to recognize as you're going for funding that in fact, state actually is doing really well. We need to know our blessings. That in fact, state has more money than some states do. So now, I think people know this, Healthy People 2010. This is an NIH. This is now getting into the health disparities component. So a bunch of federal organizations came out with this plan in 2010. It's already 2007, so I don't think we're making that great progress. And so you can actually go online and see where a lot of federal agencies have come together. How many people here know of Healthy People 2010? Yeah, good, everybody here knows. And so the goals are to increase quality in years of life, but now I want to start talking about health disparities. So the goal is to eliminate health disparities in segments of the population. And then there were focus areas developed, and there was a bunch of organizations in state health. So there's actually, documents we can look at to say where is the health disparities need. And so they've identified these 28 focus areas. And so many of these, I think we all know, diabetes, oral health, I'm for a discussion of the dentistry program moving here now, environmental health, family planning, pretty much everything you can imagine is here. And for in terms of my research, there's a couple, but vision and hearing definitely is that sensory disabilities that impair quality of life and communication and mental health, and then also learning for children and quality of life for adults. And so, of course, what is recognized, and I think what is the beauty of the health equity initiative that you have, it is very well recognized and extremely well documented, and in my opinion, an embarrassment for our country that we live in one of the richest nations in the world, and we still have to look at a table like this that gives us the numbers of, in 2003, 6.9 deaths per 1,000 live births. African American infants are 2.5 times more likely to die before their first birthday. There are these 2.5 times an entire group. And then diabetes compared with white adults, American Indians and Alaska Natives are 2.3 times, African Americans 1.6 times, with Hispanics 1.5 times more likely to have diagnosed diabetes. So there's a well-documented, statistical reason to start addressing health disparities. And San Francisco State, because of the community and these issues, is, I think, really well positioned to start dealing with these issues. And so just to, as an example, because I just put in a Pioneer grant for titled Neuroscience and Health Disparities. And just to persuade, because I just came from a year at MIT, and I'll have these conversations with people, and they look at me and they say, well, we're doing the best science, and they're doing this kind of science. And so I try to say, well, what about these questions? Well, they don't want to answer questions. So then you start doing things. So I just went to PubMed, and I said, okay, let's find out, if we put in query terms, what amount of research is being done. So if you put in breast and cancer, you get 101,000 some hits. If you look brain and cancer in men, that's 44%. You get, just I rated it compared to that. And for women, we look at that. But then you ask brain and cancer and Asian American, and there's 57 publications on that topic in PubMed. That is incredible. This to me, because you can talk about all of this, but how are you going to address Healthy People 2010 if the people who are doing the research are doing this, right? This is what the people that are, and it's unbelievable. And if you look at brain and health disparity, 14 hits. So we're talking, let's build a health equity, health disparity, and if you put in brain and health disparity, you get 14. If you put brain and cancer and health disparity, you get 1. And if you know anything about brain cancer, you know that this is very terminal. This is very, very serious, and I actually have a real interest in brain cancer. So in other words, the ratio of, what percentage is 45,206 is the ratio of the 101. So that's the difference. And so then, because I am a neuroscientist, so brain cancer, that's an interest. Alzheimer's, my mother is very afraid of this. She's terrified. I don't think minority communities, there's just a lot in the neuroscience area that I think needs to be addressed. So if you look at Alzheimer's in PubMed, there's 52,000 publications. Men and women, there's a certain percentage is equal. But the minute you ask, what about Alzheimer's in African Americans, 195 publications give you that. And if you ask Alzheimer's and health disparity, there's 9. There's only 9 publications that satisfy those search criteria. So I think unquestionably there is a need to develop research programs around health equity issues and to publish the results, because if scientists know what is published, and if you don't publish it and they're not reading it, they don't think it's a problem because it's not in their face. So I think that really, that mandate to build research teams and then really to publicize this and publish it is, I think, essential. So now, in the last few minutes, and then I'll open it up to sort of discussion, so I want to talk about opportunities and strategies. And my interests, I have a background that's very multidisciplinary. I was a physics major with a chem background, with a chem minor, and I was a chem minor because I was very interested in architecture and fine art. So I took a lot of courses in that area. And so I had to decide, do I want a chem double major, or do I want to take a course on architecture? And so I said, I'll take a course on architecture. And so I'm very accustomed to taking the non-traditional route. I just go with my gut feeling, and it's good enough. The other, I thought the physics was fine. And so I've been very interested in bridging. I like my training, but like many of us that were trained at places like Stanford and so on, we're trained with the basic science mantra. The only science worth doing is basic science. Applied science and working with communities and people is somehow less rigorous science. Does this sound familiar to those of you that have been? We're, as bench scientists, if you come from these institutions, that's what we're told. The only job, I was basically told, if you don't get a faculty job at Harvard, Yale, or Stanford, you have no business living and breathing as a scientist. And these are ridiculous expectations. And why people would say that, I speculate on this. It's not the subject of another conversation. But at this point in my life, I frankly just feel sorry for people who have such a limited view of what the professoriate can do. And so you kind of have to climb out of that, because these are your parents, and they instill you with this value, and then you have to fight the values of the system, and then you're a minority, and you're fighting that. And so I think that's why when we find one another through SACNAS, minority scientists, we resonate and understand where we're coming from. We love the rigorous science, but we ask the question, is there something more we can do? Can we serve our communities through our science? Can we do this larger task? I'm not saying everyone has to, but some of us do, and there's never a place for us. But I think that this sort of decline in research funding and all this crisis in research is a huge opportunity to step in and actually change the system. I feel when things fall apart is when you can execute change. And I love it when things get in crisis, because I found that's when you slip between the cracks and really change things. And actually there's something that I think all of you have heard, and that's translational research. And I'm going to give the perspective of health and biomedical because what I know, but I'm not only interested in NIH, it's just that there's a lot of funding and I hear discussion of R01 grants and so on. But I actually believe there's opportunity through the Department of Defense, National Science Foundation, USDA. There's many. And as I said at lunchtime, green is green. Bring it in and do the work, but do something good with it. So the buzzword at NIH now, there's a lot of change. The system is changing. They may be eliminating training grants. That's going to have huge repercussions for the medical school. The T-series may be phased out. They're already restructuring reviews and panels. So there's a lot of change happening. But the mantra now is translational research. And what that means is, and there's a website, is that people sat down and they developed the roadmap for medical research. And that's saying we need to transform how research is done. And so the buzzwords that they use now are pathways to discovery, research teams of the future, re-engineering the clinical research enterprise. And the vision that they have, you can get a feeling from by the title. So for example, new pathways to discovery, bioinformatics and computational biology. I couldn't remember the person. You already have a unit. You're doing some of this already. The molecular libraries and imaging. Many of you are already doing some of that kind of work. So there is this move to organizing along discovery, not hypothesis-driven science, but discovery science. Recognizing that these two need to go hand in hand. And in fact, that's another interesting component. Do a query of hypothesis in PNAS or anything. How many papers, if you go to PubMed, have the word hypothesis in the abstract? I think it's about as many as have Alzheimer's in Africa. It's like 200. We talk about hypothesis-driven, and we tell our students that, but we never write papers. I tested this hypothesis, at least in the field that I know. So we say one thing, and then we do another. And anyway, so pathways to discovery, these are ideas. This is how, and I'm excited by this, new pathways to discovery. Yes, use the scientific method and hypothesis-driven, but let's focusing on discovery. And to discover, you have to ask questions. Research teams of the future. So now we're seeing high-risk research, that you submit a concept, and this is the Pioneer Award one that I did. You submit a 5-page concept paper. You don't need preliminary data. Give us your best ideas. If you had suddenly $500,000 a year for 5 years, what would you do if you didn't have to have preliminary data? In other words, what that tells me, if I reinvented myself and I didn't have to have the preliminary, what science would I do? So I invite everyone to say, if I suddenly didn't have to do the science that I've been doing, what would I do if I could start fresh now, knowing everything I know and the questions I may be interested in today that weren't necessarily the questions that, we get on trajectory, we make a decision as graduate students. What did we know when we were 22? I didn't know, I read a book. Oh, ions, nerves, channel, and synapse is fantastic. I can do equations. I'll do that. That's not a reason to make a career choice. And then interesting things. Interdisciplinary research is under the research teams of the future and public-private enterprise. So this really reflects a lot of the conversations that I'm seeing here. And then under re-engineering the clinical research enterprise, this is where I think that the Health Equity Initiative, at least with regards to biomedical research, really could do some strong things. And so I'm going to talk about translational research because it turns out that's what I've always been interested in, and I didn't know it. So you live long enough, I guess, things come your way. So this is, you can go on the website and look and see what the goals and directives are. And so the premise of this is a scientific discovery must be translated into practical application. Well, that's not something my advisor would ever have told me. In fact, he told me no. So that not only is this a good thing, but they're going to fund projects that do this, and this is what we want. So discoveries begin at the bench. This is where would you fit in? With basic research, and we're scientists study disease at a molecular cellular level, then progress to the clinical or the patient's bedside. So Sally, we were discussing your telomere project, and then at lunch I was talking to somebody else, and it's like aging. There are people who are working on aging and aging communities, and you're working on telomeres. And telomeres, we know, telomerases are important with chromosomal length and maybe part of the aging process. So you could imagine that there are actually people here who along the pipeline of dealing with aging issues could work together. You know, this is the kind of way you would have to be thinking. And then this is the exciting part for me. It's really not people to the pipeline, but it's really a circle. Because there are going to be people out in the community who come back and say, you know, Elba, they're all using this particular drug a lot, and I'm noticing this behavior. I go, well, let me test it on my culture system to see if there is an effect that could explain this. And so they see it as a two-way street, that basic scientists provide clinicians with tools for use in patients, and then clinical researchers, for example, the sociologists, the people who are working with communities and nursing, make novel observations about the nature and progression of disease that stimulate basic investigation. That this is really what I would think, at least for me, what the Health Equity Initiative could provide an opportunity, and I would be anchoring in the basic science. And then that's the NIH roadmap, and whether they actually invest a lot of money in the end, I don't know, but somebody's thinking this way. And then there's funding, and so you have to be ready to go with these. The calls come out once, they're often a limited competition. They tend to be due in January for reasons I'm not sure, and I forget about this particular one. So here's a call. The CTSA initiative, Clinical and Translational Science Awards. It's done by NCRR, and it's to uniquely transformative, novel, and integrative academic home for clinical and translational science. So what do? Captivate, advance, and nurture a cadre of well-trained multi- and interdisciplinary investigators and research teams, an incubator for tools and technologies, and synergize multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, clinical, and translation, and then translate to the front lines of patient care. This is how these cross-disciplinary projects need to be thinking to pull together with regard to that. And so their expectation is that a lot of people will be involved in this, and this is really interesting. So, and this is what was really riveting when I went back and found this, the last paragraph. So you're actually done this, because the last paragraph says, to ensure the successful establishment and long-term sustenance, it's important the developed program accrue significant institutional support. You've done this. You've done this already. It'd be granted status as a major administrative entity within the applicant organization, and the program director had authority, perhaps shared with other high-level institutional officials, over space, resources, faculty appointments, protected time. This is a big subject, and promotion. So this is done. You have the foundation already of the infrastructure to develop partnerships to do this kind of thing. And then, and so here are so they gave a bunch of money. I think they gave $200 million already. And as we all know, doing this, you had to get in on the ground floor. It's probably unlikely SFSU would get one on its own just because we know what it takes, but you could certainly be part of a partnership. And so here are some of the ones I highlighted that I think, from what I've seen here, SFSU can use. Design new and improved clinical research informatics tools? Absolutely. You've got that the institute person that couldn't meet with. That's why I was excited about meeting with him. Expand outreach efforts to minority and medically underserved communities. That's the mandate of this university. Assemble interdisciplinary teams that cover the spectrum. Let's look at this. Biology, I think on board. Clinical medicine through UCSF. Dentistry, is that on board? Yes, it's on board, okay. Nursing, absolutely. Biomedical engineering, I have not seen that in this visit. Genomics, definitely. Population sciences, absolutely. It's there. But if you don't know the game, don't know what's happening, you're not positioned. But this is definitely something that's out there already. So I'm just delighted to see what you're doing because it's in a good position. And so who got the money? Well, these people got the money. And you might argue, you know what? They've had a lot of money already. If they aren't already doing this, with all the money they've had from NIH, they don't deserve any more money. You know, it's why, you know, they should, I mean, we figured this out already without any money. If they've had all this money, shouldn't they already be doing this? Why are they getting more money to do their job? Okay? And so these are the people who got it. And so they gave to 60 academic, and I'm sure they did partnerships. So California, UCSF got one. So you guys, are you involved with this one already? Must be, yeah.
Kevin Gorman.
Kevin, yeah. And so you have one already here, and so these exist, and there's opportunity here. But I guess I would favor building bridges to many institutions. I would have put all my money on working only with UCSF. I'm sorry, Cynthia, because I think it's good to, you know, and I know that connection is touted, but you know, people are a little more attentive when we just know that if we've dated. It's somehow you're just a little more attractive when you're dating more than one person. Why that is, I don't know, but that's the reality of. And so these are the universities that have it, and if we put them on a map, they're not going to be. I showed you those other maps, so part of what I do is I take lists like this, and then I put them on the other maps, and our country's in serious problems. And then when elections come out the way they do, people wonder why. I said, well, you know, there's a lot of reasons. So I just want to mention a little bit about what I did last year and my own scientific interests. So I was part of the Cell Decision Processes Center. So they got one of these NIH roadmaps in systems biology. It's a $20 million grant. I was interested from it scientifically, but I was also interested in what were they doing to organize research, because I read things online. I knew it was a translational research model. So I actually was part of a center that used this approach, and so I could see what worked, what didn't work, and you know, if I go back and do that at my own institution, how would I structure it? And really, leadership, I think, is so important, and they're fortunate that the person who put it together was a visionary, I think, Peter Sorger. He's now moved to Harvard, and so they've lost him at MIT, and I think that my sense of the project, and this is the issue of redundancy in organizations, if you have a powerful, charismatic leader, and there's no other person who does it, then the program falls apart when they leave. So I don't know how this is going to. I suspect in the competition they'll do an MIT-Harvard combined project. And what he said that I find exciting, and this is Peter and I, this is a person that I really enjoyed interacting with so much, is that he's really saying something I've felt for a long time. We have a lot of data. This is with regard to genetics and development, that we need to be thinking. We need to be more creative about how we're doing our science, rather than spending more time gathering more data mindlessly in the same format. And so when it comes to creativity, you don't need resources, you need good faculty. And in that sense, I think the faculty I've met in biology, the new assistant professors that we have here, are just world-class, in my opinion, intellects. And I think that this institution should be really grateful to them for the service that they do. And they're working in a competitive area with limited resources compared to their peers. And so how was the structure? Well, it was a hunk of change. And so it's essentially 6 R01s, but the focus of these grants really is junior faculty development. And I think anything that moves forward must be structured around junior faculty. And I think people will give funding for that, but I think senior faculty, you're going to have done it on your own in some way, maybe a leadership role. But in terms of getting resources in programs, it's going to be junior faculty development, freeing up their time, supporting them to do their work, helping them to publish, helping them to do the things they can to be successful, and to build teams across colleges. So it had the projects, they're mandated. Every single one of these must have outreach to underserved communities, and then they have core facilities for sequencing and, you know, really cool stuff. So you can do a lot with these projects. And then the last thing I want to talk about is that I wanted to do this 5 years ago, and I think I mentioned that in the application. So 5 years ago, and Ken remembers this, I did it twice, and then I gave up because I realized I couldn't do it then at that time who I was. So I was trying to build this because I was thinking about building translational research capability at NMSU. And as a neuroscientist, I tried to build it around neuroscience, and there was a call from mental health. And in retrospect, I learned that, first of all, it failed. And I think it failed clearly because I was an associate professor. I was too junior. They wanted to see someone senior. It failed because the university hadn't hired in the right areas. They hadn't hired in this opportunity area. We couldn't really assemble a team really easily that could get the mandate. And then third, it failed because, and this is why I pointed out you have to be ready on the calls. I think Cynthia's seen this. A lot of these programs that they launch, you've got to be in on the first competition. And once they're funded, it's really hard to break in because unless somebody messes up on the resubmission, you're not going to get your foot in the door. And so that combination of activities didn't work. So this is just to show you how I think and what I put together with this team of faculty. It was a team of about 6 of us. And Ken and was on the advisory board. So I called it the Neuroscience Research Enhancement Program. And so this is how I envisioned them. And so this is kind of something I was doing 5 years ago, is to provide training and opportunities for students in neuroscience, mental health, and health disparities. So we had some of this, but we didn't have a lot of the other. And so the critiques were, you don't have this and you can't do it. And it's like, well, that was the purpose of the grant. We don't have it. It's to build infrastructure, so you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. How can you get it if you don't have it? And that's why you're writing it, otherwise you should be getting R01s. And so I also wrote it to increase the participation of women and minority faculty and students in this area. And then I also threaded into it the concept of a bridge program. And I partnered with UWash because I have a lot of contacts in UWash in Seattle. And also to build a bridge to the NA. And I think you were on the committee. I think I contacted you at that time also. This was like a little dream. We have this little dream, and your child is kind of, nobody loves it. Is it an ugly child, and only I love you? I love you. And so, you know, and we still talk about that at MSU. And then to develop partnerships and to build a community bridge program. And we went to the community and found resources and people that would work with us, and they were excited. Jardín de los Niños, which is volunteer-based, where there's a daycare center for children. And they were hungry to have, for example, student interns come in and work with the kids. So there was a huge opportunity. And then these are the faculty that I brought together. I brought together faculty from biology, psychology, sociology, anthropology, counseling, and educational psychology. So I assembled the team I could find of people who were interested in doing this. And then we divided ourselves in 2 lines, and cognitive and behavioral, and cell and developmental, because we could fit into those groups. And then we chose as a theme health of women and children, because of the, well, you could choose any theme. But we particularly were interested in women and children because of the research. I'm a developmental biologist. My NIGMS grant periodically gets picked up by child health and development. And just, you know, the issues, resonating the issues of women and minorities and single parents and children, it was logical to pick this. And to bring students who are interested in health disparities and working to those communities into this. And so we structured it, we put together that they would have a support personnel, that we would disseminate information, and then we developed a scholars program because the professional development is core. Workshops in grantsmanship and ethics, you've got to have the research ethics. Support curriculum development, there was none. There still is no curriculum development at NMSU in mental health disparities. And in mental health, but the idea was to bring in money to free faculties like mini grants so they could go and receive training, go to UWash and establish a partnership, bring in grantsmanship, develop a lecture series and have people bring in a partner. You know, do these kinds of things to have people work together. And then they let you put in these research sub-projects, so we had 2 of those. And then, of course, the outcomes was, you know, to work with this community, and the goal was to really have a presence for this, you know, the usual program. So that's what I wanted to just give you the flavor of how I think, what I've done, opportunities. Some of this may be redundant. I haven't picked up on everything all of you are doing. But I hope I've made clear why what you're doing here I really admire, and a little bit about how I think in terms of how, you know, I could plug in potentially, and opportunities. There's lots of opportunities to do what you're doing, and I'll stop there, and now you can ask me questions.
So for the CTSA grants, do you know if there's supplements to them, or
that, what I have found out, I'll talk about further, you know, it seems to me just about everything's negotiable in this world. And, you know, when you find out, I find out, I didn't know you could do that, and well, it's not written anywhere, but I just called and asked, and they said, okay, for you we will. So call. If you find the CTSA, so you're involved in this, I was not aware, maybe you mentioned it, I missed that. So is SFSU involved in the CTSA?
All I know is that myself and somebody from, we met with the people who were putting together the CTSA proposal, whatever I thought they were still doing. And they wanted to get some of our information to show that they were doing outreach to us.
So they took your information, you're on the grant, did you know that they got the grant?
Oh, but so I was just curious.
Oh,
I was involved. I was
yeah.
involved during the early parts of developing that grant within the system. So it was something that had been worked on for 2 years
Yeah.
prior to the actual
When did it just get awarded?
submission.
Just get
It
awarded?
just got awarded,
2006?
yeah, they just awarded it last year.
So is there, as far as you know, that they put in a component to work with the
I don't think
state?
there's a set, I mean, they put in potential partnerships around.
Potential.
Yeah, I mean, they had some definitive ones. And then I think, I mean, I don't know, there may be other
Yeah.
people that were involved here, but
Yeah.
I didn't specifically see who they ultimately listed as formal partners. But again, it was being spearheaded by a clinical
Yeah.
person, of course, which was new for the university to have a clinical person
Yeah.
lead such a large enterprise.
And-
But that
and
was the whole idea.
who was it?
It was, what was his name?
Was it Kevin Gilbert?
No,
No.
it was a younger physician.
Well, you can access
He was writing part of it, I just wanted to open
you can access the abstract online and see if your name appears on. Yes,
Yeah.
Bruce.
I just wanted to relate to your MLIS program. We have one here.
I know, you guys got one, yeah. I met with people at lunchtime.
Yeah, one of the critical features when we first wrote that proposal was to provide institutional support. And we provided an enormous amount of release time for both those individuals who were submitting their own projects, and more importantly, to try to build a cadre of other individuals. And we also submitted a core application at the same time, and that both got refunded with new PIs. And again, on the core program, they were particularly impressed with the level of support that SFSU had provided outside of what they received from the agency. The feedback that I've had from all of the information from that program is that has really been a critical element in terms of success. Unfortunately, they're cutting all those programs left and right,
Well, and
especially the core.
yeah, and so when we went in that year, the budget was cut. And then he says, and you're coming in, and several are coming in for the competing continuation. And then you go online, and you know what? Here's my thought about it. When I see these, the institutions that are submitting, you know what? Whoever gets it, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
And so the way I look at it is, when I saw it was funded, they're going to do good things with it. You're sad, but you're glad that this exists. But yes, and so they're cutting them. No, and in fact, I talked to the program officer recently, and he said they might only just fund small grants for the core development.
Now, the point that I really wanted to make
Yes.
is that one of the issues for our campus in the behavioral sciences,
Yes.
and this is why we wanted to get MRIS funding,
Yeah.
was that we lack individuals doing research in the mental health area, although we have some. So I think that's a component, that continuing to attract people who have a track record, as yourself, and as Cynthia and so forth, is going to be critical for us to continue to be able to compete for those kinds of proposals.
Yeah, I think, and I think you can't be everything to all people, and I think there's that foundation. I mean, I look and, just off the top of my head, Cynthia can, to me it seems aging, and then it is an important component, and then the mental health and the cancer. You could imagine, pick three. It's really hard, but I'm disturbed. People think of mental health and as something somehow aerial, it's mental health. I go, you know what? You can be absolutely miserable, but we know that if your body can be very challenged, but if your mind is positive, it's our minds that give us, that sense of mental health that's so important. And I don't think we're doing a lot of addressing symptoms and things that are tangible. And mental health is critical. We see that with students, and was it you was telling me this epidemic of suicides among young people. Katrina, now they're finding out that there was an issue there. And so I think developing a mental health component is critical to anybody who's interested in doing community health and outreach, because if you're ill or dealing with people who are ill or dealing with management, there are issues of mental health that come up. But I could be wrong. This is my thought.
I wanted to follow up a little bit about you were saying, establish these collaborations, for example, you were saying with UCSF, they have the CTSA, go see if you're in the abstract, that sort of thing. So the thing is that sounds all good, You know, it's like I just want to call up CSF on the phone and say, okay, give me the person in charge. That's good, you know. And what strategies do you use to?
Multiple strategies. I think a lot of what happens in these programs, honestly, is people just forget. I don't know who has, I mean, I start out with, maybe it's as simple and innocent. My initial way of dealing with things is not that somebody did something, you know, but rather, okay, let's just assume that it was, they forgot, it's misorganized or something. And so you can, if your name is on the, and the reason I say that is because you talked to them, so they were looking. And I have since found out that in our college, I'm listed as co-PI on a bunch of grants that I never knew went in.
I know what that was.
You know, and so I think people do that, they forget, or maybe they think they told you, or some dean said, here, put Elba on, she'll be fine. I don't know how that happens. And so it's entirely possible that they wrote the grant, and then maybe the person who was going to contact you left. And so it has bearing. You know, so for example, you could say, gee, I heard you got the CTSA, that's exciting, I know I spoke with you, are we going to be working together? And one or two things will happen. They'll say no, or they'll say yes. Well, I guess they could say, I don't know. And so it doesn't hurt to do that. Now, I also think that we've had this conversation about money. You know, everybody wants the money, and somehow, they're not going to be able to do translational research if they don't have access to the communities. And they're going to want to get that for free. I'll just put that out there. You know, there's the ethical issue. Yes, you know, you're kind of put in that quandary of, well, but it helps the community. But I would just say that the allocation of resources also needs to reflect the partnership. And then particularly after the lunchtime meeting with the nursing faculty that have that 6-course-a-year load and that have access to communities and are working and may have projects that are mental health relevant, that if there is a partnership, there's some negotiation, and they'll understand. But they're not going to necessarily volunteer. I mean, you kind of, this is like the other side of the realities of the practical. People don't necessarily volunteer. You kind of have to have that dialogue. So I would say, do you know who called you? Do you remember?
No, I just was.
Just give them a nice follow-up call to congratulate them on their success. That's a nice call. To say, by the way, or you could even do worse, I'm excited about working with you on this. And then they have to tell you they're not working with you on this. So anyway, so. Other questions?
So, you know, when you were showing the search of articles and sort of, you know, how
I can't tell you how these questions.
But talk to me a little bit about this, because there is a lot of debate in the fields, in all different fields, about our focus on disparity as opposed to equity. And so there is sort of, again, you know, and some editors won't allow you to use race and ethnicity unless you have a biological basis for including it as a variable in your data analysis. And more and more journals are making authors justify that.
Interesting. That is so interesting.
So just wondered what your thoughts might be given that, because obviously it does have implications.
Well, I guess I find that a really interesting, I'm kind of just amazed. I can understand why that would be the case. But when, on the other hand, NIH is giving translational research funds based on this, I'm just amazed at the scientists who are working in areas where that would be the case or not. Well, there are, I think this is where we often see new journals founded. You know, I mean, I think there's a point where you just have to move forward on this. Or do multiple communities. And I said that at lunchtime, that the power of what's here is that you can actually, you can actually focus on process, and because of where San Francisco State is, that how can diversity not be in there if you are doing a good job of sampling the population? And so really generate cross-cutting, because I do worry that you know, about doing good experimental science where you have good controls and you do appropriate controls, and to find out what are the real metrics that are underlying things. Again, so it is a problem. I think it's a problem that might merit people writing letters to editors about how the community addresses it. Because if on the one hand, there's an issue of health disparities, and there's Healthy People 2010 with health disparities, and we're in a profession where we're supposed to publish about health disparities, If the journals refuse to address that, then we need to have a larger professional conversation about that. Because then there's no outcomes of any of the funding for health disparities or research, you can never publish it, it would seem. So people are having their papers returned after they do the study?
Well, no, the argument is that why would you think that there'd be a racially based difference unless you think that race represents a physiological, biological difference? And so the argument is more about, is it about race and ethnicity, these disparities? Or is it about something else? And it's very easy because then people can be stereotyped as a consequence of that. So one could say, well, because you're black, you have this, this, and that.
Oh,
And this
no, I
happens
get
in the
where
field
you're
of
coming
HIV.
from. And that is really, really important.
Yeah.
And personally, I think that a lot, and I think we all know this, it's social economic. You have to have access to the health care. But it's also naive to say that certain community, you know, it's a probabilistic thing. If you are a member of a certain community, you have a higher probability of being in a certain social economic, you know, sort of level, just because of the patterns of migration and the history of what's happened in this country with slavery and people, you know, walking across the border and coming from different communities, and other patterns of migrations of people who fly across, who come from backgrounds. It isn't per se necessarily because of that. And I think, you know, and so the other way of addressing that is really to look at economic needs or, you know, access to health care. But we also know, where I live, that it isn't because they're Hispanic per se, but because Hispanics in the state that I'm in tend to be, on average, poorer and don't have medical care. So how can you deny that reality too? So I guess that would beg the question of the experimental design. And that's, see, and again, that's news to me, that's information to me, that's not anything I would ever know. And that's part of the conversation, because I deal on the bench side, I go and I see, you know, the need, but on the other hand, if we're being funded for health disparities, and I can't find an article on health disparity, how can I write a grant? There's no publications. So it's a, how is the field addressing it? I guess I'd ask you, how is the field addressing that? Are people addressing that?
Well, I think it's pushing people to think about how we describe our sampling.
Yes.
And what it is we're trying to actually say. So if the outcome of our research is that black women are more likely to become HIV positive, does that say that there's something about being a